Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. We are so fortunate to have with us Susan Brower from the State Demographer's office to talk about our changing demographics. We started talking about this both at the city, school level, many months ago, and you're a tough person to schedule.
Sorry.
You are very sought after. And so we finally landed on a date, and we said, book it. We'll figure out all the logistics eventually. Many of us have heard Susan before. The information she has is really interesting and so important to all of the different entities that we represent. We can just look around our region and understand that things are changing. And those changes are things that we can either or embrace and figure out what we do next. And so the slides that we're going to see and then the discussion hopefully we can have are really going to help our community figure out what we do next. And again, thank you so much for being here. So with that, Susan Brower.
Thanks. Hi everyone. I want this kind of a big group to do this, but I wonder can we quickly go around and say who's here? Is that okay? Just so I know. I know I was asking before, do you all know each other? And they're like, pretty much, but maybe.
Mark Carlsruhe, I went to school with.
Pete Moulton on the Public Works.
Ed Johnson, City Council. Todd Crafty, I work for the City of St. Peter.
Linda Whitty, League of Women Voters.
Russ Willey, Community Development Director.
Carolyn Gobler, also League of Women Voters.
Ken Russell, Chamber of Commerce Board.
Michelle Lynn Fisher, County.
Matt Peterson, Police.
Chief Practice, St. Peter Schools. Cheryl Lustig, Century 21 Avenue Realty.
Thomas Dick, Minnesota Valley District.
Jessica O'Brien, Regional and Development Commission.
Vicki Hager, School Board.
Paul Peterson, St. Peter Schools.
Ben Leonard, St. Peter Schools. So David Breezy, Minnesota Historical Society.
Sherry Brostrom, St. Peter Development Board.
Sally Wolfels, City of St. Peter.
Corey Eagles, various nonprofit organizations.
List them. No, I'm just kidding.
Chadley Blake, St. Peter Development Corp. Mike Faber, St. Peter Chamber Board.
Richard Downing, the VP for Enrollment at the Service.
And Lee, St. Peter Chamber Director.
Susie Carlin, St. Peter City Council.
John Kwame,
Marie Drummond, Lakewood County.
Cassie Sassenberg, Health and Human Services Director. Tammy Stater, St. Peter Schools.
Oh, thank you.
Roger Paris, City Council.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate that. So, my background, I'll just start out with a little brief thing so you can know where I'm coming from. I work for state government. We're a small office. There's just 5 of us in my office. We do population projections so people can kind of figure out what's coming in the future. We do estimates so that the state can distribute funds to different communities across the state. And then I do a lot of talks like these about how we're changing. We do analysis about how we're changing. My background is in the social sciences and demography. And so in state government, I'm not in a position where I'm appointed by any elected person. I'm just here for the long haul and love data. When I'm not being a demographer, I'm being a mom to a sassy, I don't know, I think it's snarky now, snarky 16-year-old and a 12-year-old. So that's me, driving my minivan from town to town. So I want to share with you some things that are specific to St. Peter, but some of the stuff that I'm going to share with you is statewide, and it is because some of the ways that demographic changes operate in local communities is that it's big and it's shifting everything around you. So I kind of want to give that additional context because while you will be seeing evidence of some of these changes where you are, part of the kind of pressures that will change your community and change your businesses and change your institutions will be kind of coming from the larger demographic shifts as well. So I'll speak to both of those. Please stop me as I'm going, because I think this side, do you want me to use this so you can hear me on there? Is
Yeah.
this-
Might need to turn it on.
All right. I need to pretend like I'm, no. Okay,
Perfect.
good. Please stop me as we're going if you have questions, because I think that I don't want to be talking about something that you're not tracking with if I didn't describe it well. I like talking all the way through with you all. If you have questions, just stop me as we go. Okay. So I'm going to start out just by talking about how population is growing generally in Minnesota, in the U.S., and then specifically in this region. So Minnesota does pretty well in terms of growth overall if we compare ourselves to other Midwestern states. We grow a little bit faster. We're just not growing as fast as the South and the West, and we're close to the U.S. average. But if you take everyone that we've added to the state since the last census, since 2010, we've added about 300,000 people. Most of those people have been in the 7-county metropolitan area, and that growth has been a little bit more concentrated than it has in past decades. That growth has picked up a little bit just in the last 10 years or so. You can see the very darkest areas here show you where the growth, it has been the greatest in the state. But any of these counties that have a color are showing some growth. The gray counties are where you see some population losses. And so you can see that there, some of this is part of a longer ongoing trend where you have population losses in some agricultural areas, some rural areas. But many of our areas that have cities, that have metropolitan areas are experiencing growth. It's not that just the Twin Cities is growing. Many of these areas are growing. It just happens to be concentrated right now, particularly in the metropolitan areas in the cities. Not to say it doesn't happen elsewhere, but that's where we see a lot of that growth happening. So, kind of looking at the growth of cities around this neck of the woods, we can see that St. Peter has grown. This is just growth estimated since the last census, added about 740 people since the last census. You can see that Mankato's growth curve is a little steeper, but this is kind of on par with North Mankato as well, just in terms of the growth that's been happening. And in terms of growth rates, if we're just looking at the changes every year, this decade and last decade, you can see that there's been kind of dampened growth across the board. There's dampened growth, if you can barely see it, but there's dampened growth statewide, dampened growth in Nicollet County. The growth rate used to be a little bit higher, closer to 1%, now it's about 0.5%. Same is true, St. Peter, really all of these show that same pattern. That's not unexpected. Here's what people do when they think about growth slowing down. Oh no, people are moving away. Or they think, oh no, why aren't we getting as many people as we used to? They think their minds, and it's just fine if that's what you did, their minds immediately go to migration as a way of growing. And that sure is part of it, but a bigger piece of it is just who's living here now, and as we age, it gets harder and harder to grow as communities and as a state. And that's what's happening right now, statewide and for many individual communities. So let's look at that a little bit more in depth, just to kind of understand these dynamics. If we look at just Nicollet County and the changes that have happened in the last 8 years, this is the number of people that were added because of births in the county. This is the number of people who were subtracted, I guess. That sounds kind of unpleasant. Subtracted because of deaths in the county. There's a little bit of international migration here. And then domestic migration kind of goes back and forth from year to year. So it's kind of hard to pick out what that pattern is. Domestic migration would just be people moving to the county from other places in the state or other places in the U.S. So anywhere outside the border, you get these numbers from. But what I want you to take from this is most of what's happening with respect to growth. And if we look, if you look at Blue Earth County, the same is true. If you look at the state, the same is true. Most of what is driving the population change is just how many babies you're having and how many people are in this high mortality age group, how many people are passing away. So don't go immediately to, oh no, we're not growing as fast. Because that's just the case across the board. We're just moving into this time of slower growth because we have more older folks in the state and in our communities. So that's just kind of background context for some of the changes. And I want to give you a sense of what population aging looks like in the state and in your county and communities around here. Population aging is the big trend that is going to impact everything from public budgets to housing to our school system, not directly, but all of these things will have some kind of, our workforce, our workplaces are already starting to experience some of the impacts of population aging. We'll talk about that too. But I want you to understand kind of what the trend looks like and then what the impacts potentially may be, so you can plan for how to respond or how to anticipate those trends. So this is for the state of Minnesota. We'll look more locally in a moment, but this is just showing you how many additional older adults we have each decade in the state. And so for the past 6 decades, we had anywhere between about 47,000 and 90,000 additional older adults each decade. That group was growing because the state's population was growing, so it was inching up over time for all of time since the 1950s, and even before then, but that's where I started this graph. What do you think it's going to look like this decade? Don't guess lower. Okay. Right. So in the state, we're adding close to 300,000 this decade. We're already in 2018, right? Next decade, we'll add about 300,000 on top of that. So we're going from about 680,000 older adults in the state to about 1.2 million in the period of 20 years. So it's been creeping up, and then we've got this blip, and then we stay older into, so that population continues to grow after that, just not as fast. And this is happening when we look at this statewide, it's happening when we look community by, not every community, but it's happening because the baby boom generation is aging into the 65-year-old age mark. And the baby boom happened across the state, it happened across the Midwest, across the U.S., across much of the Western world. This isn't a unique feature, this is just something that happens to be happening right now for the first time in our state. And so there are some kind of new conditions that come along with that. One way to think about this, again, these are statewide numbers, I'll show you county numbers in a minute. But here's that big baby boom generation. If you think of this graph like an escalator, every 5 years everyone moves up the bar, every 5 years everyone moves up the bar, you start to get a sense for the inevitability of this aging trend. There's not much we can do to change the aging trend. This was set in motion 50 to 60 to 70 years ago when the baby boomers were born. There's a little birth cohort. We never talk about Gen X, my personal favorite. After that, and then we have the millennial generation, which again is a bigger generation. But this is what is driving a lot of the changes, particularly where we're feeling it right now, is in workforce changes. And we're feeling it now in the workforce because these baby boomers are moving out of the workforce in large numbers, just like we would have expected them to 65 years ago, 70 years ago. You know, this is no surprise, it's just that it's happening right now, and it's starting to have real impacts on people, particularly people with businesses. Now, Nicollet County looks a little bit different. Oh, it looks like I lost my label. This side is males, this side is females. Looks a little bit different just because of the college population. But for the most part, you can see what's happening over the next 10 years. You've got this bulge that is set to move upward. If we looked at that again in 10 years, we would see that bulge again moving upward. And so what you will have in your communities in Nicollet County and in St. Peter, in many places, is going to be a larger share of people who are in their older years. And so some of the pressures that we feel that we don't, some of the things we don't even know that these demographic trends impact until they start changing. And I think the workplace, the supply of workers is one of those things, because we're starting to feel kind of what that means. Again, we'll look here to state numbers, and then we'll look at county numbers. I think I'll grab water. So, you got a question for me while I drink some water? Okay, what is it?
Why do we see in Minnesota, reduced rate of growth?
So I think basically what's happening is we have more people in the older ages. So we have more people, an increasing number of people who are passing away to the great beyond. It's really hard to grow when you have an older society. It's harder to grow because you have more people who are in those older ages. And see, I didn't have to go to graduate school for this, but let me just tell you anyway. I know that 70-year-old men and women typically don't have babies. So you just don't have a lot of growth from older societies. And so as we're aging, as we see these, what we call population pyramids creep upward, we have fewer and fewer people kind of in these prime parenthood ages for the state overall, and for many communities, although it looks pretty good here. It looks like there's a pretty stable supply in Nicollet County. That's why it's slower growth, just because you have more people who are in those high mortality age groups.
And we're not getting those age groups to move from other areas.
Right, so you don't have a lot of in-migration or out-migration either way. In this county, it's really right on the margins. But what you do have, we can look a little bit more specifically for this county as well, but what's mostly driving these changes, a little bit of growth from international migration. It's a little bit of growth some years from people moving here from other places. That's what this kind of set of bars looks at. But most of what's driving changes are just that slight uptick in deaths, which we would expect to continue as we age. I'm sorry, you guys are like, I'm bringing you down. It's going to happen. But this is happening across the state. And so when you see those lower growth rates, it's not, don't take it personally. That's how it goes for many communities. Increasingly, as we age and as these deaths creep up, it gets harder and harder to grow just from our own internal momentum. And we have to look more and more to international migration and domestic migration to grow. Because these two things aren't doing it for us anymore. For Minnesota, we expect that deaths, we'll have more deaths than we have births by about 2040, just after 2040. And at that point, we would cease to grow as a state, if not for any other people coming to the state. So it's just, it'll happen, for some communities that would be the case. For the state, it'll be the case. It really depends then on how many people you've got moving from other places. Okay. Oops. So one of the things that the aging of the population does is it also makes it really hard for the number of workers in the state to grow, and the number of workers in counties to grow in particular. And that's because you have so many people who are age 65, somewhere around that age, who are moving into retirement. You've got a bunch of people at the younger age moving in as well, but it's just really hard to keep up the amount of growth that we've had in the past when you have so many people retiring. And so what we expect for the state in the coming years is that we will have almost no growth in the workforce. We'll add maybe around 6,000 to 7,000 additional people each year, but that's, in the 90s we were adding 55,000 additional people. We didn't even know it, we just thought that was normal. That's what you do, right? You put out a job posting and unto you comes 15 resumes from which you can choose your best and most qualified candidate. That's just not the case anymore going forward. And I know employers are starting to feel this across the state. This isn't just something that is a metro or a rural or mid-sized community phenomenon. It's really something that a lot of employers are beginning to feel, and it's really just being driven by our demographics, by birth patterns from decades back. I want to show you what we have projected for Nicollet County. We don't make city-level projections, that's why I keep showing you back to Nicollet County. But what we have projected is just a very moderate amount of growth countywide for the next 10 years, and then actually a decline after that. And again, that's based on how much we see people working right now, at what ages, and how many people you're likely to have. So what that tells you for your county is the number of people that you have here today available to work is very close to the number of people that you'll have in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years. And it takes a little bit of a different mindset to get your head around how you move forward as a community, as an employer, especially, knowing that the pool of workers may not expand greatly in the future. Now, migration can change this. I mean, this isn't a given. This is based on what we've seen in the past, but it doesn't mean that it has to be that way in the future. And indeed, many communities have seen growth seemingly out of nowhere. Usually it's connected to some kind of economic development or economic opportunity that people move toward. I wanted to point out that right now in the state, there are a whole lot of job vacancies, the red line here, and there's not a lot, there's not a lot of people who are actively looking for work. That's a really different situation than we had around the course of the recession. Look at, we had all kinds of people, 250,000 people actively looking for work and about 40,000 jobs. Now that's flipped. We've got about 140,000 people, or 140,000 job openings in the state, and we've got about 80,000 people looking to fill those jobs. This is statewide. If you look, there is some data that's regional that you can look at, and region by region by region, this holds. That you have this surplus of jobs over and above the number of people that you have looking for work. Tell me business owners, tell me chamber folks. Does this ring true for you all, or is it a different story here?
We hear it all over the state.
Yeah.
All the directors, everybody. It's the top priority is workforce and that challenge.
Yeah. I hear it too.
Almost every production facility in town has a dozen openings.
Oh, really? A dozen, yeah.
Demographer, the circuit board manufacturers.
Okay.
We've actually had work that was planned to come here when they closed the San Jose, California plant that didn't come here.
Okay.
And they're moving some of their work out here because they just can't get enough employees. So it's crisis.
Yeah. And that's across the state as well. It's different, of course, from community to community. You don't have all the exact same employment opportunities. But in general, this is one of those great big trends that we could see coming for decades. And it just happens to be here right now. There's other changes like this that aging will bring in the coming years that impact public budgets, for example. But that will be as the baby boomers start reaching the older ages, not retirement ages where they're going to the lake or they're going to wherever it is they go after they retire. That's when they get later into their 80s, when we really start feeling the need for more long-term care and for healthcare services. So, right now in the state, the job openings are across the board. There's job openings you mentioned in manufacturing, but really a lot of healthcare jobs, retail jobs, food service, accommodation. There's kind of a glut of jobs in those industries. And unfortunately, where those industries are, the median wage is on this axis here. Unfortunately, there tends to be lower wages where we have a lot of those jobs. So it's not like open jobs should solve all problems. This is just the fact of life right now is we have a lot of open jobs, many of which do not pay enough to cover basic living expenses for a family. Okay, we looked at that projected growth in the labor force. Looking at this, now this is city specific, so this is the distribution of jobs here in the city of St. Peter. We talked a little bit about manufacturing, but that being the case, I would say looking at your distribution here, healthcare and social assistance is at the top, educational services, manufacturing, retail, and accommodation and food. I would say the bottom three and even the top all are within that group that is really hurting, that is hurting for workers and that has had a growth in high demand for some time now. I would probably take educational services out of that because there's some different dynamics that are at work there. But certainly, if we go back to see kind of statewide where those job openings are, it almost perfectly lines up with the industries found here in the city. And so that's an ongoing issue. That's kind of a different change in mindset, right? It's not we just need jobs, we just need jobs, we just need jobs. It's we need specific jobs. We need jobs that pay or jobs for which there are pathways to other jobs. We have to be a little bit more choosy in terms of our economic development in this particular situation, because we don't expect growth to come from just an endless supply of people. And that's okay, it's just what it is. Don't get bummed out. It's just what it is, it's just different. I was asked to speak to kind of what migration looks like here in this county. See if you can decipher this for me. This is not a pop quiz, I just wanted you to look at this. We're looking at net migration rates by age. So this is 0 to 4-year-olds, 5 to 9, 10 to 14. Whoop! Uh-oh. We got lots of 15 to 19-year-olds. Oh, we lost them. But the thing about Nicollet County, you don't often see the same pattern where you see positive. You see this net in-migration. This was during the 2000s. This is the most recent data we have. You don't see this positive in-migration at those years in all communities. So that's something that's unique to Nicollet County. Of course, this is the college population. One of the things that you can think about in thinking about how you grow your community and retain workers is you all are lucky enough to have this supply of young people. I'm all done. You're like, boring, we're done. No, just kidding. That's my boring alarm. I'm kidding. You're lucky enough to have a young supply of young people coming into this space, into these neighborhoods. That doesn't happen everywhere. And so I would encourage you to think about how you can, probably do, but how you can continue to make connections with the college students who move here even for a short time, because that's a supply of folks. Being in a place and being familiar with a place and knowing a place is it's a huge part of why people make a decision to move eventually to that place. And so I think for cities that have colleges or have some kind of flow of young people, it's a really interesting kind of opportunity to think about how can we bridge our community and that flow of students to the area. Okay, I want to talk about trends and diversity, and then I want to see if you have questions or comments for me. Just want to show you kind of what it's looked like nationally, what it looks like more regionally here. The state has become more diverse, more racially and ethnically diverse over time, particularly since 1990. And statewide, the numbers have increased among major race groups, including Black or African American. That includes African immigrants, newer African immigrants, and U.S.-born African American blacks. Latino populations and Asian populations are really what's driving the change statewide. And I know once you get more local to local communities, you see a somewhat different mix of folks, but that's what it looks like statewide. And if you look at Nicollet County, it follows almost that same pattern. The 1990s is where you start to see that increase in diversity in the region. So that now about 1 in 10 of the population, I know we were talking about the school district earlier, but of all ages, about 10% of the population are people of color. It's a little bit lower, that 20% of the number statewide, but again, it's been growing at roughly the same rate as the state overall. I wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening with earnings and what we might expect to see in the future. I think one of the questions I had in advance was especially how it relates to family income and child income of families with children. And the good news, I will give you good news, guys. Incomes have increased since the Great Recession. That's been true here. It's been true statewide, nationally. We do see, and these are numbers for St. Peter. I'm sorry, the label fell off here, but this is St. Peter. You do see increases in full-time, year-round earnings. That's a good thing. It's going in the direction that we would hope to see it go. And we have seen, over time, an increase, not going in the direction we would hope to see it go, but we have seen an increase in child poverty across many of the communities that I visit, across many of our counties, across the state overall. So, how does that work? We have all these jobs.
Could you define child poverty?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So poverty is, the definition of poverty is laid out by the federal government. It's based essentially on a basket of goods that a family would need to cover to kind of cover basic living expenses, in theory. However, the poverty line for a family of 4 with 2 adults and 2 kids is about $23,000 a year. So it's very low. There are other kind of cost of living calculators that put that number close to double that number at $46,000 or so for a family of 4. The poverty line shifts a little bit if you have more people in your family, if you have older members, if you have children. But in general, this is just the number of children who live in families where the income of that family is below the poverty threshold, again, generally around $23,000 for a family of 4. So that's creeping up. So we just saw numbers where median income was increasing. That's a good sign, right? We saw that the demand for workers is high. I didn't tell you, but we have seen wages begin to creep up too. Those things are going in the direction we want them to be going in. So what's going on with child poverty? Well, It does move somewhat independently from overall income and earnings. It's not tied as directly to the economy as the overall poverty rate or median income, and that's because family structures are changing so much. And it's really pretty, when you think about it, it's really pretty easy to see when you have a family with 2 earners in the family, it's much easier to be above that poverty line than when you have a family with just 1 earner, a single parent. And so it's happening kind of independently while we have these increases in well-being and in income and in job opportunities for people. We also see kind of this ongoing family change where we continue to see more single parents, either because the parents never married or because they split up after they had children. So that's just part of where we are today as well. So we don't know, kind of going in the future, I can't imagine that we'll see any massive change in family structure. So it's possible that we continue to see our child population to be in these kind of tenuous circumstances regardless of what happens with the economy, with economic growth. Yeah?
I know we're here about Newport County and St. Peter, but why the significant number in Newport County for poverty?
I think it's college kids.
So I've heard that it's because
You've heard that one?
it's you, but I'm
Yeah.
wondering if that's more out by more information as well.
Yeah. Oh, but this is child poverty.
That's child care.
But that would still be, no, it'd be 17-year-olds.
So it's 17 to 0
Yeah.
to 17.
You know, I'd have to look specifically to try to tease that out. I don't know that off the top of my head. But I know when I was looking at St. Peter's, the poverty rate specifically, it didn't look like most poverty rates age-wise. And it was hard to read, I'm sorry, but St. Peter's poverty rate, most recent poverty rate is at 21%. And if you look kind of where the highest rate of poverty is among that group, it's the 18 to 24 population. So I think it's being influenced. College students aren't supposed to have income. Well, maybe they can have a little bit of income, but their full-time job is to study and to kind of forego those earnings now for later. And so you do see inflated rates of poverty among in college towns. Yeah. Did I see a question?
I was just commenting on the 25 to 34, but still pretty high.
Yeah, it is. I will say, and this is why I didn't want to, I will say about these numbers, they come from something called the American Community Survey, which is a Census Bureau survey, one of the biggest surveys we have, and so it's the best data we have, but it still has pretty high margins of error, which means when you get down to a community that is 11,000 people or so, you start seeing, numbers that may be 30 plus or minus 6 or 7 percentage points, which then I don't know what to say about that. But I will say, this stands out to me. You're right, this is still high. I would say maybe that's real, maybe that's just sampling error. You guys would know on that one better than I probably know.
Surveying hospital patients?
No, they wouldn't be included. So this is just for people, the poverty rate is just measured households, and are your college students on campus? Vast majority on campus? Well, and that makes me suspicious of that one too. Let's go back to Nicollet County where I'm less suspicious. It's really unfortunate. We've switched over to a system where we have data all the time from this American Community Survey, but the data have these margins of error. So you never know. You have to rely on your local knowledge to know whether or not it's a real thing or it's just something strange in the data. The poverty rate generally is measured only by people in households. So I would expect that the hospital and Gustavus, you don't have a large off-campus population here. That's not what's going on. It's probably the same thing here. Yeah.
So would group homes count?
Group homes would be included in it depends on what the group home is, but many of them are included in institutions. Sometimes it depends on the size and the purpose of the group home. So that may play a role too.
Well, they're in dwellings, they're in a house.
If they have been categorized into the group quarters universe, then they wouldn't be included in this kind of a survey, but that doesn't mean that on the ground that's how that's. Okay, so, we've seen this improved economic picture in Minnesota across the state. We've seen incomes and poverty. This is going back again to the state overall. We've seen these numbers kind of drop off in terms of the poverty rates overall. That's a good thing. This is all ages now. But we still see really big differences in terms of rates of poverty for different groups. And so I just bring this up to say things are going in the right direction, but we still have big racial and ethnic disparities in well-being across many of our racial and ethnic communities in the state. Okay, before I move on to questions and comments, I want to talk a little bit about the 2020 census. And that is because they make me. I don't know who they is. I make me, I guess. The 2020 census is coming up in about a year. And it's one of the ways that communities can get funding and can get political representation for the coming decade. So it's really important that you all as a community help us promote the census, let people know about it, let them know it's safe, let them know it's a thing, not that anyone's interested in their particular information, but they're interested in what the good is that comes to the community. And so there will be opportunities, there are opportunities for community members to get involved and to help promote the 2020 census. It'll come back to the community if you get a good count. And it will be kind of with you into the next 10 years.
And we are going to have, the council's already determined that there's going to be a complete count committee. And so many of the folks that were invited to this will be hit on within a few months. I think we're going to kind of launch probably in August time frame, maybe September time frame. So you can expect some correspondence at that time and ask for some folks to participate.
Thank you. Do you have questions for me or do you have comments? Or are you hungry? You got candy.
Do you see significant changes in, you used to see that in St. Peter, home ownership percentage was in the low 60s, and statewide it was much higher. Maybe some of that was because of the perception of college town, but that isn't so much because we don't have so many students living off campus. Has that changed statewide? Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, I mean, especially since the recession, we've seen an increase in renters. It hasn't been overly dramatic, but it's a noticeable increase. We've also seen kind of fewer people at the older ages with mortgages completely paid off. What we haven't seen yet, statewide, is really a movement of the older adult population in great numbers out of their kind of family households. That's starting to happen in some areas, but at some point that will be a thing that we notice. We notice baby boomers right now moving out of the labor force. We don't see that impact quite yet on housing, and I would expect that that's on the horizon. Yeah. I mean, many older adults have been surveyed about where they want to be as they age. Many say they want to stay in their communities. Most people don't want to pick up and leave. They've got roots, they've got ties. But they also say that they want to have something that's easier to care for, something that's on one level, something that's smaller in general, maybe less yard, at least when surveyed. And so while people want to stay in community and in their home to the extent that they are able, there's also, a downsizing that we expect will begin in large numbers. It's just, it hasn't quite hit us yet. So that'll have implications for St. Peter as well, that some of that housing stock that has been occupied by the same folks for a very long time. Those folks will be looking for some of those places within their community that meets those needs. Yeah.
Any estimate on the probability of Minnesota losing a congressional seat after the census?
Oh, it's so close. It is so close. The most recent estimate that came out after we got our population estimates last year, that came out in the fall, very unhelpfully told us we're either keeping a congressional seat or losing it, which tells me, and the numbers are like 10,000 in either direction, which tells me it could be 10,000, it could be 1, it could be, I mean, this is part of what's at stake in the next census, is do we keep that 8th congressional district? I'm not from a background where I was and I'm still not involved in politics too much, so I didn't understand why people would say, oh no, we can't lose that congressional seat. But since I've been traveling in greater Minnesota in particular, when you start looking at the size of the congressional districts, you can see very quickly that losing one of those districts is going to expand those congressional districts by a tremendous amount, by about 100,000 additional people in each district. And particularly in greater Minnesota, where you've got a more sparsely populated area, you're just going to have to expand that. It's going to be that much harder for any congressperson to represent the interests of the community. So keep that concentrated power. Let's get a really good count to be able to get, the districts might grow anyway in some greater Minnesota areas. We saw the map with those gray counties that have been losing population, so it's likely to grow, but we don't want it to grow any more than it absolutely has to. So that's part of what's going on. Yeah.
In a couple different places, I've heard that within the next 2 years, that the millennials will outpopulate the baby boomers. What changes or forecasts do you have, or your office have, on how that changes communities as the age flips over and goes the other way, outside of saying that more people are going to die? But what does that do to communities like ours that in the past decade or more have expanded greatly into the aging environments for people to move into? What does that do statewide or locally, or how can we grow or benefit or whatever that is in the community in that change?
Thank you. Yeah. So as I said, the workforce is the first to feel it, kind of because that's where baby boomers are making those transitions. But there will be other impacts through public budgets, which means that as baby boomers begin to move into the years where they need more long-term care and healthcare services, it's expected that most of that will not be paid for by private individuals, that the majority of that will be public costs. And that's based on the fact that, looking at wealth of baby surveys that look at the wealth of baby boomers, savings of baby boomers, and also what the typical need for long-term care and healthcare is, it means that we're coming up on something that will mean very high public costs, statewide, countywide, and it will flow to communities as well, which means that the impact of aging is not just on whatever you can see around adults, it's broader than that, and it flows through kind of the availability of funds from the youngest of children to kind of the oldest residents. So what I would say moving forward is there is this kind of big question mark about how we will pay for the services that we currently provide in this new era where we have really high costs for caring for our older adult population. I mean, if you want to think about how this gets localized here, keep in touch, it says. It doesn't want to go back. Okay, I was going to just show you the population pyramids again. That you in Nicollet County have that big kind of bulge happening up at the older ages when you start, when you start getting up toward age 80 and have a critical mass of people there. Of course, they demand specific services, but I want to encourage you to think about the fact that this also impacts funding that's available for schools, funding that's available for, people in their middle ages, for public health types of things. Thank you. Let's look at Nicollet County again. Right. So it's really when you start getting up around age 80 here, when you have this group, it's more like 10 years out or so that you really have that group moving into those age groups. So I don't want to bring you all down again. You're like, oh, enough, lady, it's enough. But I want you to know that on the one hand, these changes will continue to unfold if we're ready for them or not, because we're just going to keep aging in this direction. But it also means that we can try to do things differently and more efficiently than we have in the past. And when I say more efficiently, I don't just mean at a lower cost. It may be kind of big changes that we haven't considered up until this point because we haven't needed to. I feel like that may be not specific enough, but I want to draw the attention to answer your question, but I want to draw the attention to the fact that really what I think is coming in 20 years or so really has much more to do with kind of the whole system of public financing in general, over and above kind of little tweaks here or there. It's not all bad though. You can do good stuff. You can do good stuff if your population looks like this or if it looks younger. It's just a change. It's just a matter of kind of lining up with the circumstances that are in front of you. Yeah.
One of the other, you showed the states and the different colors for counties that are growing and counties that are reducing their population. So.
Never mind. I remember it.
Yeah. So for us, we were slightly growing.
Yeah.
Is there something that's magic out there that we can do to keep that happening? Is there, or are we going to be like Faribault County, which is draining like crazy?
Yeah. Let's talk about Faribault County and then let's talk about Faribault the city in terms of a contrast of what's been happening. So you've got, it really depends on the economic opportunities. It's being driven by the economic opportunities for families. But the areas that are growing in the state, it's almost perfectly correlated. It's not perfectly, but it's very well correlated with immigration. So when you see a county that's growing quickly, it's because they have a sizable population of either immigrant, for the most part it's international immigrants, or people kind of moving back home from being away in their 20s. You've got that kind of migration too, that people are coming back home to communities where they were raised.
So there may have been that brain drain for a while until they're 35 or something, and or 32, and then people come back.
That's happening across the board. That absolutely is happening community by community, rural community across the state, and probably even Faribault County. That it's not a one-way direction. It's just how big is the outflow versus the inflow. And then as we get older, are there more folks coming in from outside? And if there are, what's pulling them there? And typically it's jobs. As we move forward, as more people have access to broadband and we can work anywhere, I think that many communities in the state will have a new opportunity to pull people in that they didn't in the past. Most people in their 30s, most workers when they're moving, they're already partnered. And so you're not just resettling one career, for many you're resettling two. And so couples need to make some hard decisions about if this community has everything we need, if we can commute. And I think as broadband increases across the state, that just opens up more opportunities for couples to be able to live and work elsewhere.
We'll just add on to that, Todd. The next slide, I think there is a lot we can do locally because you look at the different cities, and no disrespect to LeSueur, but that's a pretty stark graph. And I think it's clear that cities in our area are growing or aren't growing. And I think they've got jobs. So clearly other reasons, they're closer to the metro than St. Peter by 11 minutes. So there are other factors there, quality of life, daycare, schools, lots of stuff. But that actually makes me feel better because, it's hard to look at downward trends or some of those trends and not feel a little bit hopeless. But within that, there are going to be pockets of success, and I think we're well placed to be in that pocket.
Absolutely, I do too. And I think, it's really, even what we've seen in terms of decline in agricultural areas, we may see a turnaround in that. I don't need to be so down, guys, but we got warmer weather coming. And that really is going to have some major impacts on what grows where in the coming 20 years or so. So this isn't all business as usual in terms of budgets, in terms of agriculture, in terms of whatever industry. There's a whole lot of changes coming, and I would say kind of just being open and flexible to the extent that you can, to line up with the circumstances, be they demographic or industry changes. Change is going to be the name of the game in the coming 20 years. So. Yeah.
I have two questions, kind of. Are people living longer? And are people retiring later? And is that helping the workforce if they're retiring later?
They are living longer. They are working longer, and they're living longer. But they're not working as long as the gains in life expectancy don't translate directly to the gains in labor force participation. So the extra years of work are spent out of the extra years of life are spent outside of the labor force for the most part, but we are seeing a little bit of an uptick in labor force participation at older ages. It doesn't change drastically. Over the last 25 years, we've gained maybe 5 to 7% for 65-year-olds, 5 to 7% more in the labor force than 25 years ago. So it's ticking up, but it looks still the same, where you really have a lot of people retiring either because they have to or because they want to once they reach about age 65. So
is that measure full-time work?
What I'm thinking of is full-time work. So you do see kind of a bit of an extension with some part-time work. But for what we see, at least statewide, you do see that labor force participant. That's for all work, part-time and full-time. Yeah, you do see it drop off pretty quickly.
We were told 2 years ago by Shantara Hardy, the former, she might still be with me, she was an assistant commissioner, she said that North Mankato MSA had the second highest labor participation rate in the country compared to all the MSAs.
Okay.
And so that means teenagers and women and elderly and handicapped are all participating.
It's really high. In Minnesota, it's second only to North Dakota. And part of that is because of women's labor force participation. So, the good news is we have a lot of productivity of all our residents, young people and women and older adults. The downside to that, of course, is that you don't have that opportunity for growth when you get in a situation like we are now. It's really about attracting new folks, as we're talking about. If we're going to grow labor force, it's about attracting new folks to those jobs and to those communities. They're out there. Yeah.
You earlier had addressed how the South and the West, of course, are increasing in population. In the Midwest, how do we compare with the border states?
In terms of population growth, we are growing at a faster rate than I'm trying to think of our border states right now. But I'll tell you what, a lot of the growth that is being driven in Minnesota is being driven by the metropolitan area growth. So if you have, and a lot of that is due to international immigration. So if you have border counties that don't, or border states that don't have large metropolitan areas like North Dakota, you don't have that international flow of immigrants that's kind of bolstering growth. So Minnesota leads kind of our cluster of states in terms of growth because of international immigration. Of course, North Dakota has growth from the, from domestic growth from the oil industry. There's some, in terms of Wisconsin, there's some growth there, but it's not to the same level as we see in Minneapolis.
So more Iowa students can attract to go to college here.
Yeah, that's right. And most of the people who move from other states in the U.S. are really coming right from our borders. It's not, there are people who come from afar, but for the most part, if you look at where they're coming from, they're already here, they're already familiar. They come short distances first, not long distances. Any more questions for me?
I have a question. So Minnesota's been traditionally large state for refugees, primary refugees and secondary refugees from other states. What are some of the impacts if that slows down or decreases in the program? Like where is that refugee program like in the demographics? How do you see that changing, or does it fit in with diversity?
Yeah, so what we have seen in the last 2 years, the estimate that's come out for the last 2 years is that we've actually seen decreased international immigration year over year. Still growing, but just not as much. We still get international immigrants and we get growth from it, but it's just not as much as we had received before 2 years ago. Part of that is because of the caps that have been put on refugees, particularly Somalis. So you see less international immigration, you see less growth coming through. Right now, that growth typically impacts cities and metropolitan areas first, but eventually it's felt elsewhere as well if it continues. That's just a small part of the international immigration picture. We also see dampened growth in terms of our international student populations in the last couple of years, in terms of H-1B, the high-skilled visas. So it's down overall, and that's really across the U.S., and we see that in Minnesota as well. The impact of that is, I showed you projections for what we think the labor force will grow by 6,000 to 7,000 additional people each year. If we have dampened immigration due to federal policies or because people choose not to come here for whatever reason, we'll see our labor force shrinking rather than growing slowly, pretty quickly. Because our numbers are really close to on the margins right now. So it would be very possible. And some states already see this. Vermont has a shrinking labor force. They don't have a lot of international immigration. So it's something that we kind of expect to see going forward, but maybe it's not an assumption that will play out given kind of the current political context around immigration.
Susan, we promised that when we originally made this, we promised we would keep you past 6:45. We know we got to get back someplace. So
I'm happy to talk to folks. If you have more questions for me afterwards, I'm happy to talk with you. I'm thrilled to hear that you have a census committee that you're launching, and we would be really happy to support that work out of our little office. That's something that we're working hard on too. But thanks everyone. It's been nice to talk with you.
some of you may have noticed that we are recording this, so this will be on SPPA or on the St. Peter